So good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Michael Lerner. I'm the principal here at Bard High School Early College Manhattan, and I want to welcome all our guests and our panelists. And because many of you may not be familiar with the Bard Early College program, I just want to briefly explain that the early colleges are a partnership. The New York City schools are a partnership between the New York City Department of Education and Bard College. The school began in 2000. This school, which is the first of the early colleges, began in 2001. Our founding principal, Ray Peterson, is here with us tonight, which is a great honor to have him here. And if you're not familiar, if whatever your relationship is to Bard College, you may not be familiar with the early college model. The easiest way to explain this is that this is a branch campus of Bard College fused with a high school. So the students who attend the program do 2 years of high school coursework and 2 years of college coursework, and at the end of the 4 years, they receive a high school diploma and an associate's degree from Bard College. And we've been doing this work for 19 years. Today was the first day of school, so we welcomed 165 new ninth graders today. And they began in typical Bard fashion with a writing workshop. So we have a 4-day writing workshop that begins the year, and then off we go. But this is also a wonderful part of the Bard spirit, of the Bard culture, that we have events like this. And we want people within the Bard community to think of this place as much a part of Bard as the campus in Annandale or any of the other programs. So we're very happy to have everyone here tonight, and thank you for coming.
Good evening. My name is Malia Dumont. I'm Chief of Staff at Bard and Vice President for Strategy and Policy, and I'm also an alum of the school from the class of '95. And I'm very pleased to be here this evening at the Bard High School Early College Manhattan campus. Thanks to all of you for being here. We have a nice crowd here, and I also want to acknowledge that we are live streaming, and we have a virtual audience as well, including a classroom of students up in Annandale who will be texting in their questions during the Q&A. That's why I have my cell phone up here. But I invite anyone who's on the live stream, no matter where you are in the country, in the world, when we get to Q&A, please put your questions in the comments. And I have a student monitoring that who will send me your questions, and we'll get to them. I do want to acknowledge that student and the work that she and her colleagues are doing up at Bard. That's Ava Mazie and the Election at Bard group. And Ava won a national award this past year for the work that she and her classmates up there have done to register voters. They registered over 400 voters last year. It's a nonpartisan group. They're not trying to sway people one way or the other, but they're trying to do work in support of our democratic system. And that's something that we applaud, and we're very proud of them. So we're gathered here this evening because this is a critical time for our democracy, the run up to this next election. We have a president who, by anyone's measure, is very controversial, who has very different views from his predecessors about what American leadership looks like in the world, and what the role of government is with society. And there are a lot of increasingly difficult global challenges arising at the same time. The challenges of climate change, a lot of growing instability, international relations. So in this context, it really seems like this coming election is going to be potentially the most critical election in a generation. And what we do at Bard is we really try to think very critically about difficult questions and problems and develop deeper understandings of them so that we can engage more productively as public citizens. And that's why we've decided to gather this panel, and we hope to have a series of panels over the next year to learn more about what's happening in the world and how to think about it. So I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel here. I'm very pleased that we have some Bardians here to help us think about this critical time. So next to me I have Dylan Byers from the class of 2008, and he's now a senior media reporter at NBC and MSNBC. And he's the author of a daily newsletter you can sign up for. I get it every morning myself. It's called Byers Market. And it covers the business of media, technology, and entertainment. He's normally based out in LA. We were lucky enough that he happens to be in town, so he's able to join us this evening. He's worked as at The New Yorker and also at Politico, where he launched the On Media blog, and also at CNN. Next to him, we have Rana Faruhar, who is a Bard parent. Her daughter is a student here at the Bard High School Early College Manhattan campus, and we're very pleased that she could join us. She's a global business columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times. She's based here in New York, and she's also CNN's global economic analyst. Her book, Makers and Takers, The Rise of Finance and the Fall of American Business, about why capital markets no longer support business, was shortlisted for the Financial Times McKinsey Book of the Year Award in 2016. She has a new book coming out in November called Don't Be Evil, How Big Tech Betrayed Its Founding Principles and All of Us, which is about the 20-year rise of platform technology and how it has reshaped economics, politics, and society. And she previously worked at Time and Newsweek and was a foreign correspondent covering Europe and the Middle East. And then next to her, we have Lukas Alpert, who's from the class of '99. He's a media reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and he was part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting this year for a series of stories uncovering President Trump's secret hush money payoffs to women who claimed to have had affairs with him. He was previously a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in Moscow, where he wrote a book called Kremlin Speak: Inside Putin's Propaganda Factory, about Russian media manipulation and disinformation campaigns. He studied Asian studies at Bard, and he's also worked at the New York Post, Daily News, and the Associated Press. So I think you'll agree we have a very distinguished, very experienced panel here to think about some important questions. And I'd like to start off the conversation by asking you about your views on the resilience of our democracy. When we talk about this as being a really critical election, there's a sense that that perhaps our democracy is the character of our democracy in danger of fundamentally, perhaps permanently changing with the direction the country is going. And you know, what signs are you watching as you're looking at this election cycle to see whether that's actually the case or not? And maybe we'll start with you, Dylan.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I don't know if I was always on Leon Botstein's good side, so it's a pleasure just to be invited back to the stage. It's a really important question. It's you know, I think from where I'm sitting, covering particularly the sort of intersection of media and technology with politics, I don't worry terribly about the health of democracy. I think citizens seem to me to actually be very engaged in the political process right now. I think it's not a particularly civil space anymore by virtue of the fact that people have become sort of so wedded to their own, you know, there's sort of been a ghettoization of people's political opinions to the point where people aren't really talking to each other or in the same way they used to, agreeing on the same set of facts. But the sort of level of concern and involvement in the democratic process, I think, is very real. And I think that, you know, technology, for all the harm that it has done to the democratic process, especially in 2016, there is so much potential for good. I mean, there's so much potential to make engagement so much easier. I mean, we're actually not that far away from this conversation about how hard it is for some people to get to a voting booth. At a certain point, by virtue of having a phone and a social security number, you're going to be able to just vote from your phone, right? So the information is more readily available pretty soon, like the means by which you can participate in democracy is more readily available. I think that there is, this is probably something we can dive into later. There was this really glorious period of time from 1960-something to 1990, maybe early 2000s, when we had a really concentrated news media, right? And there were only so many channels people watching, there were only so many news sources people watching. And I think the fact that we're entering this world where all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, you know, if you are this kind of person, you get your news from over here, and if you're this kind of person, you get your news from over here, and never the twain shall meet, that is actually the way the world worked for a very long time leading up until the 1960s. So that is not, that seems like this terrible sea change moment, but it's actually a return to what's very normal. And I think we're just going through this period where the new technologies, we're sort of figuring out what that world looks like for us, sort of in a post like there's just ABC, CBS, and NBC. But we're going to navigate that. And there will be a hierarchy where trust will matter, where facts will matter. And I think we will work through this sort of process that can often feel like a nightmare. It might just take some time.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's such a big question, and as you were speaking, Dylan, I was thinking that, like almost everything in our politics and in our economy right now, my thoughts about this question are very bifurcated. So, on the one hand, everybody in media, almost everybody in media got the Trump bump, right? You know, we all saw our subscriptions go up, our publications have been more read than ever before, particularly at the high end, because people really want to understand what's happening. On the other hand, you look and see that more Americans, and in fact more people in the world than ever before, are getting their main news source from social media. And in the developed world, that coincides with a decline in trust in liberal democracy. And this goes to some of the points that you made about silos, you know, people being in the red camp or the blue camp. I actually saw some really interesting research recently by a think tank, bipartisan, designed to look at voting patterns in the US and Europe. And they asked both Democrats and Republicans their views of the other side. And they wanted to see who's most biased about the other side. And the results were really fascinating. They found that the least biased people in general were uneducated Democrats and educated Republicans. And I thought that that was really interesting. And when they drilled down, it has to do somewhat with where you're getting your news. So a lot of, and I'm going to make very blanket statements here, but I'm basically just quoting this research, a lot of uneducated Republicans are in the kind of talk radio silo. Some educated Democrats are in the very, how to put this in a way that won't, won't get you immediate tweets. You know, people that sit around at dinner parties that people like me throw and say how terrible Trump is. And, you know, maybe have never been to Indiana, which is where I grew up, which voted red. My county that I grew up in was actually 75% red. So there's a lot of siloing on both sides. And on the other hand, the good news is, you know, our institutions have been more robust, I think, than they're given credit for. Nobody's banging in the door, you know. We're having this discussion. I'm looking forward to a really exciting next 18 months or so of coverage. And I agree with you. I think that we're going to be entering a new golden era, at least in terms of the media being able to participate in this debate.
Thank you for having me as well. I think, sure, okay. Hi, okay. Thank you for having me. No, I think following with what Dylan was saying about, you know, we're in this period of really great distortion of information, which is new because of the channels that are available to people, your ability, the news consumer now has incredible choice, but people aren't used to that. It used to be, I had the paper that was in my town and that was it, 3 channels, maybe a radio station. Now I can choose from, I can read a blog out of Zimbabwe if I want to. I can, you know, pick and choose it. People aren't used to that. They're maybe not totally like sophisticated enough to make great choices. They're just being flooded with information. I think a lot about this. When I worked in Russia, this was very much the atmosphere, was disinformation, a lot of lack of trust. So people, even the most educated worldly people, really just didn't trust anything. They had been under the Soviet Union. I think basically they knew that they'd been lied to for 75 years. They didn't trust any of it. This gave great rise to conspiracy theory. Everybody, the most educated person would tell you the wildest thing that they believed, that it was all a plot. Everything was, you know, some fake thing. And it was just, what ended up happening there, though, was that people disengaged. So people were, you know, even educated business people, traveled a lot in the world, were not engaged politically at all. There was no upside to it, to engage politically in that environment. And it was just impossible to plow through. So people just tuned it off. And that is, while we have the distortion here, people have not switched off. And I think that gives me some hope, I hope. Maybe if this goes on and gets worse, maybe we end up in the thing where people start tuning it out. I hope we don't get there. But that would be, like, to me, the tipping point. I think we're a long way off from that being the problem. But, you know, so far, I think human engagement is you know, in the political system has strengthened. People are getting more information. They're trying to figure out how to interpret all of this. It's a lot of fits and starts. It's not the healthiest environment to be in. But in terms of our institutions, I agree with Rana that things have held up. I mean, the checks and balances have kicked in. You know, when the executive branch oversteps, the courts have stepped in and swatted them down. I mean, it's been a very uncomfortable period to see some of the things going on. But I think so far we're okay. I mean, I just hope, you know, there's going to be a point where we get to the end of the funnel and we'll be in some other environment where we kind of have a better sense of what the landscape is in terms of information. We're not there yet, and I don't think any one of us knows what it's going to look like, but there'll be something. So.
Well, it's interesting. So to pick up on that, the concept of fake news wasn't in the public lexicon prior to the previous election. It's arisen since then. And what you're talking about, that fake news in Russia was so prevalent for so long that it really led to disengagement in the public sphere. So now this idea of fake news is I mean, it's popularly understood, and there's a problem of declining media literacy with this proliferation. On the one hand, it's great that we have all these choices and you can read the blog out of Zimbabwe if you want to, but on the other hand, the discernment and the ability to sort of, you know, choose between these things has not been strengthened at the same rate that there's the proliferation of all kinds of varying quality media sources. So what do you think, besides convening forums like this and having places like BARD where we really focus on critical thinking, you know, are there other things that we could be doing to help drive greater media literacy among the public so they could discern between the fake news, and it becomes less about my identity is this and so I read this news, but more about I can take an analytical approach to this and really understand what's going on out here?
So can I say something on that?
Yeah, sure.
Is this working now? No. Hi. Is that better?
Yes.
Awesome. So there are two kinds of fake news. There's actual fake news, which is just stuff that is just put out there and is categorically incorrect and often intentionally, willfully incorrect. And then there's this sort of general growing sense that has to do with a larger story about the decline in trust in American institutions across the board, which is this general sense that, like, even if you are very squarely in the anti-Trump bandwagon, I think that there is his constant attack on the press is sort of been somewhat effective, because I do think that there is this feeling among a lot of Americans that the media is not 100% trustworthy, and oftentimes, you know, 50% trustworthy. And there is a way in which certain media institutions are not doing themselves any favors, right? I mean, there's a certain sense in which, look, every media company, with the exception of the nonprofits or ones founded by donors, they are businesses, and very often they are parts of businesses, and they need to make a certain amount of profit. And if they were just giving you accurate, boring, watered down, you know, information all the time, they would not be good businesses, and they have to participate in entertainment, and therefore they have to give you conflict. And so every day you get palace intrigue out of the White House that is totally inconsequential, and yet you are led to believe, because the reporters or the anchors are lighting their hair on fire, that this is somehow an existential threat, and people are sitting around a table in New York or DC freaking out about it. if I am the average American sitting at home watching that, I'm like, you know what? This is fake. And it's not fake in that it's necessarily inaccurate, but this isn't real news. This is entertainment. This isn't doing what I used to think news did. And so this is a long-winded way of getting around to answering the question of what can be done to sort of restore faith in news. And I think what needs to happen is there needs to be somebody who can crack the code of coming up with a news product that is simultaneously so captivating from a media entertainment standpoint, but simultaneously bridges the gap of our partisanship and gives you a product that gets beyond this sort of like hyper-partisan world of cable news debates we've been living in, and offers you something that is a little more compassionate and sympathetic and understanding toward all American people. Because right now, as Rana said, there's an immense amount of bias among this sort of so-called NPR, MSNBC watching community, who have basically written off like entire states or entire swaths of the population on the assumption that they are racist or bigoted or uneducated. There is no sort of sympathy for them as a common citizen. And then by the same token, there are a lot of members of the sort of right-wing media sphere who don't want to have anything to do with the coastal cities like New York or LA. There needs to be someone who can somehow offer a media product that is both entertaining and captivating and succeeds in providing all Americans with a sense of that trust is a value add, that compassion is a value add. And whoever figures that out, that could be an incredible business.
I'm going to pick up on that because this is a larger economic question as well. I think that in order for that business model to exist, and actually one of the advantages in this last couple of years in working for a publication that's based in London, British publication, global circulation, we're about a third US, third Europe, third Asia, is that I don't have to be in that cable silo. In fact, it's my job to pull back. But this brings up an interesting point because the FT costs about $400 in print. It's about another $400 for a digital subscription. So our readership is the C-suite. And if you look at voting patterns, basically you can overlay how much you pay for content with what you're getting, right? You know, if you're getting most of your news from social media, which is being funneled through Google and Facebook, which by the way, Google alone now gets more advertising revenue than the entire print media industry. It's almost as big as television now. And in fact, I think when Trump, this another prediction, maybe I'd be curious Dylan's thought. I think when Trump is out, I think cable news is going to get as quickly disintermediated, actually maybe more quickly disintermediated than newspapers have been, because frankly, they have less to sell. They have, and you know, I'm an analyst for CNN, and I will say this. A lot of what's being picked up is just talk and opinion. So once that oxygen goes out of the room, I think that you're going to have, for better or worse, more news sources that are under threat. But at the end of the day, we are businesses and we're catering to the community. And what we need to do is, I think, actually create more events just like this one, where people are actually coming together and speaking not with an air of blame or any finger pointing or any criticism, with very open minds about opposing views, because that's where you start to get people that are not biased about the other side when they're actually in the same room together. You know, that's what all social science will tell you.
I think about the kind of the signature moment in the 2016 election cycle was really like the fake news thing, which we as a society in America were really not prepared for. This absolutely bogus memes flooding your social media channel. We're now all generally pretty switched on to, hey, that exists. I think its influence and its power is a lot less effective. But what we're going to have in the next cycle is really hyper-partisan news, and this is where, again, something I learned in Russia about how propaganda works is that, like, it's hard to say that's just made up, because there's always a kernel of truth at the center of it. It's just spun where some key piece of context is removed. Social media loves this stuff, because what do you need context for when you're looking at something that's 140 characters or 280, whatever they do now? But the point being that we are now in a place where people, like the next step will be this other level of sophistication, how to distort reality. And what you're going to see is a rise in localized news products that are actually funded by super PACs. This is going to show up in every battleground state. Yeah, it's already happening. It's going to get worse. You're going to have campaigns themselves launching their own news platforms. Everybody can be a publisher now, so that's wonderfully democratic, but is also, again, can be very distorting because there's no gatekeeper anymore. And the social media channels have so far refused to really play any real role in creating any sort of filter for any of this. Hey, we're just a dumb pipe, like let the water flow, and it's like filled with a bunch of sewage. So we may get, like, they're starting to try to figure out ways to do this, but I think this next cycle is going to be like less like dumb, like misinformation, like more sophisticated misinformation, but like it's just going to be like worse and more of it, and I don't know what happens next. But, yeah.
Add something to that, because this is a part of the book that I just wrote, Don't Be Evil, which looks at it uses Google as the lens through which to look at some of this stuff. This is a big issue. It's going to be a big issue, actually, I think, on the election in the campaigns. Elizabeth Warren, for example, has made corporate concentration of power a big issue. Many of the Democratic candidates have. What we're talking about in fake news is in part enabled by the fact that the platform companies are not liable for misinformation in the same way that any of the publications or networks that we work with and for would be. And that's a loophole that the tech industry lobbied for hard, have, just like the big banks did pre-2008, have spent billions of dollars keeping. And to your point about how sneaky all this is now, it's not even just creating stations, targeted news in certain areas, it's buying up the academics that people like us call to try and find out the answers. I mean, it is really, really hard, even if you're a professional at this stage, to find unbiased sources about this stuff.
Just a few things to pick up on. One thing you said earlier is about where cable news is going to go after Trump, and I think this is a really important point. There was this like really big Trump bump because there's a certain sense. One of the great quotes about CNN was CNN is more like, it's just sort of like the hospital. You go there when there's an emergency, but you never stay there any longer than you have to. And that it's, no, I know, but it's true. There's this sense of like, if it were the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we had cable news, you would watch like for all 13 days, right? And Trump created this phenomenon where we felt like, oh my God, we're in a 4-year Cuban Missile Crisis. So there is this huge bump, but conceivably that will go away. The one place that television news and cable news really has value in the political realm is that it has the big events. It has the debates, it has election nights. No one else knows how to do that. TV is a very, very hard medium. It is very hard to make a debate happen. It is not like in 2020, Twitter is going to host a debate. These things belong to CNN, they belong to NBC, they belong to ABC. But outside of that, the media is, no one has a claim to the media. People get up in arms and they're like, did you see what Fox News did? Did you see what they said on CNN? If you take the combined audience of the primetime audience of Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC on a good night, you're still talking about a population across all 50 states that is significantly less than the population of the 5 boroughs of New York. Okay, so it's a very small population. The New York Times subscribership is very small when weighed against the amount of people who go to the voting booth every 4 years in November. So no one has a claim, and I think part of what's happening when we talk about media, and this is very difficult, but we have to think about what we're talking about, because we're not just talking about the 3 cable networks, we're not just talking about the 3 big newspapers, we are talking about this weird sort of amalgamation of information that happens when you turn off the debate and you see something on Twitter and then your friend texts you a link to an article from a news site that you've maybe never read before. I mean, it's just so multifaceted now. And then The other, and this, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, the law you brought up that Google and Facebook use, which is Section 230, is what makes them not responsible for the content that appears on their platforms. I would just, this is a debate perhaps for another panel, I would venture that that is not necessarily a wholly bad thing. I think it's worth considering whether we actually, there's added value to having platforms where corporations or government do not police speech, and we're actually able to have those platforms be open up to a point, but that's probably a conversation for another.
So to follow up on what you were talking about earlier, you suggested that we could get someone to break the code on media and create this special product, so kind of like a Walter Cronkite for the 21st century, we'll say, maybe. Yeah. And you suggested maybe community engagement is one way to overcome this problem of lack of media literacy. But what about some of the underlying structural issues that would limit how much progress even the best sort of community engagement could bring, or the most successful, Walter Cronkite version 2.0? There's a lot of talk about how gerrymandering has created these problems that we're now seeing manifest through social media. So do you believe, what is your view on some of those underlying social structural issues that are really driving the way our society is interacting these days?
I don't have a specific thought on gerrymandering, but to go to bigger structural issues, education, education, and I'll give a little Bard shout out here. My daughter is in, are you still taking conspiracy theory? No, that was last year. Sorry, she's now on live stream globally and is getting really embarrassed. She took a great conspiracy theory class, which I have to say, the dinner table conversation, just the pressing and the subtlety of the awareness of, okay, not just U.S. media, not just print versus social versus TV, but global, activists versus traditional journalists, all this, that's really rarefied air. But education is the thing. And in fact, again, you can overlay patterns of education and where people are getting their news, how much they can afford to pay for it, which is all part of what I think the biggest, not only election issue will be, but the biggest issue facing our country, which is economic bifurcation. And I have always thought, I've written a lot about this with some backlash, I've always thought that everybody in the media is spending too much time on the culture wars and not enough time looking at the class wars, which I think are actually much more interesting and impactful. And actually, class is culture when you start to break it down. But I think that that's something that is at the heart of everything we're talking about. And education is the way around that. And that ladder is broken. I mean, this school, BSEC, is a wonderful way of fixing it. There are other examples around New York and in the country. But in my world, that is seriously the number one, I would say, mid to long term, not just social problem, but economic problem. I mean, the Fed recently put out some research showing that student debt is one of the biggest mid and long term headwinds to the overall American economy because millennials don't have any money to spend. 70% consumer spending economy, nobody has any money to spend. Do the math.
So I just want to, if you can take every problem in society, in my view, and I'm very much in Rana's camp, and you can, it will always come back to education. It always comes back to education because at the end of the day, you can talk about all the issues, you can have policy debates. The amount of people who have both the will and the time and the intellect to be concerned citizens, to come out to an event like this, I mean, you have to have the resources to have the time to do it. You have to have the education to actually care about it. You have to have been taught that you should be an engaged citizen. Like, it is such a crazy privilege to go to Annandale-on-Hudson for 4 years and just think about like how to make yourself a better thinker. I mean, that is a crazy, I remember being in a house in Tivoli and I was like, what am I doing with this literature degree? Like, what am I going to do with this? What is the point? What job am I going to get? And one of my classmates was like, look, the point is you are teaching yourself how to think critically about the world. The vast majority of people do not have the privilege or the time to do it. And what's hard, I think, is there's this issue of student debt, the issue of how much education costs, but we're also entering a time where we're having a very reasonable and worthwhile debate about whether or not there shouldn't be more vocational training. Not everyone needs to spend $40,000 or $50,000, $60,000 to go to higher. I mean, it's hard. It's just economically not feasible. And so, I think one of the great struggles of our time is that we are simultaneously living in a world where it's harder and harder for people to get really great high-class education that would enable them to be concerned citizens and participate in the democratic process. And at the same time, I think we need that more than ever. And I absolutely do not know how you reconcile that.
I think that one area, following on the education point, really one area is just media literacy is a big problem right now. And I think if you really look at, the people who subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and the FT and the New York Times, and really are engaged media consumers, so this is maybe 15% of the population, that might even be generous, let's say it's 10%, so that's 15%, who really every day read news, watch news, pick up a little bit of news. That's about it. And those people, if they were, if they didn't vote, it wouldn't really matter because that's not a very huge amount of people. About 50% of the population are sort of like part-time media consumers, where they read a magazine when they're waiting at the dentist's office, or listen to a little radio when they're driving. They don't do it on a daily basis. They don't do it on a regular basis. These people actually do vote, these are the people that political advertising is for, because it's the last thing that they hear is what they believe is what's going on, because they don't see the follow-up story the next day that maybe corrects the record a little bit or stuff like that. So I always think about it this way. We wrote a lot about the National Enquirer and the question was, why is that important? This thing doesn't really sell much. It sells about 150,000 copies a week. What does that mean? But what it does is that when you're standing in your shopping line, and that's millions of people, and this thing is sitting there saying Hillary Clinton is a racist criminal, that has a subliminal impact on people who are maybe not that well informed. And maybe that can have some impact overall. It doesn't have to be very big. Didn't have to be very big in 2016. Anyhow, then there's 30% of the people who don't consume any news at all. They probably don't really vote much either, so I don't really know what you do about that. But that 50% of people who really are easily duped, misinformation, easily, swayed by political advertising, you have to kind of figure out, now that they're being flooded with information, I don't know if that's a class you can teach in high school now, media literacy. I mean, it just seems something simple like that. How do you adapt to this atmosphere?
So I think we're going to open it up for questions, and so we're going to put this microphone, I believe, is going to be over on this stand. So people here in the room who want to ask questions of the panelists, you're welcome to come over to the microphone, and you can address all of the panelists. And then I invite folks who are watching this on the live stream, just type your question in the comment. Please identify. We'd be interested to know where you're watching. And if you want to address, again, any or all of the panelists.
Hi. So I've been following the coverage of the Trump-Russia interference issue for a while, and it seems like a lot of the coverage is focused on how Trump's involvement is within the context of the United States elections, and focusing a lot on Trump. So I'm wondering what we're doing about the interference on the part of Russia, and what we can expect in terms of interference in this upcoming election. Are we doing anything? And also, why is there no media coverage of what Russia did?
Yeah, okay. It is a good question. I mean, really, I think from a government standpoint, they're not doing very much. It's not particularly like in the interest of this administration to acknowledge that the election might have been affected by this the last time. I mean, and I don't think that that's something that shouldn't have been expected. You know, like what administration would admit to, hey, this thing really questions the legitimacy of our existence. So, so no, I don't think they're doing very much on a government level. I mean, maybe the NSA is doing stuff that we don't really know about. But from an official standpoint, no, I don't think they're doing very much. The question about like what did Russia do in 2016 was really pretty kind of not terribly sophisticated. It was very effective, but it was not like very sophisticated. I think what we'll see in this election is that the stuff that will really disinform and cause chaos is stuff that has to be a bit more sophisticated. So I don't think they're going to be able to replicate that in any easy way. They do this in other countries. They've done it in their neighbors for years and years and years. This was not like something they just came up with. They do this they did it in Ukraine, they did it in Georgia, they did it in Estonia, thus creating all this distortion. I don't think they'll be able to replicate that again. The one thing I will say about Russia is that they really understand American culture way better than we understand theirs. So they knew exactly the things to pick at, the scabs. Maybe they come up with some new perambulation, but the thing they did the last time was cheap, it was easy, and it was effective. I don't think you could do that, pull that genie out of the bottle again.
I'm actually going to respectfully disagree. I think that they will do it again. It's already being done, and it's not just Russia. I actually think that this is a bigger issue, which is the sort of massive shift in how warfare is conducted. It's now conducted digitally. Russia is really a supplicant to China in many ways. We're in a trade war, tech war, Cold War with China. There's more and more overlap and disintermediation of information coming out of that entire block. That's going to continue. Our side is, I'm quite sure, doing the same thing. And I think that it underscores not only how woefully ill-prepared the entire public is to kind of evaluate media, but how behind we are in our foreign policy, in thinking about how other nations are interacting. I mean, Vladimir Putin is worth remembering, and you would know better than me, but he was, if I got this right, he was a KGB agent that came up in Dresden and watched the Berlin Wall fall without a shot being fired. This is a whole new world, and it's actually much bigger than just the media.
I would agree with Lukas that the current administration does not care deeply about acknowledging this threat, but I would disagree that steps aren't being taken. And in fact, yesterday, Facebook hosted a meeting between the FBI, DHS, and DNI, and Facebook, Twitter, Google, and Microsoft. And it was basically a preparation for enhancing election security for 2020. And this is not, they're not getting around to this just now. This is something that they've been taking. They took steps to do it during the midterms. They've been taking steps to do it in elections in other countries with significantly bigger populations. They care, the Silicon Valley cares deeply about this issue, not necessarily because they're stand-up citizens, though they may or may not be. They care about it because the last 3 years were really, really annoying for Mark Zuckerberg. Like, really annoying. Like, the worst 3 years of his life. He doesn't want to have that happen again. And in fact, in a classic example of scandals getting, tons of coverage and then resolutions getting very little coverage, you didn't really hear a lot about this fake news thing during the midterms because Facebook actually did a pretty good job of taking care of this, of flagging bad content, flagging malicious content that was coming from foreign actors. It is, Zuckerberg himself has said it is an arms race, so the way that Russia and actors in China and other countries will try and interfere in the election, that will get more sophisticated. But at the end, one just quick thing about the Russia thing, it was very significant, and no matter what influence it had on the election, it is troubling, and it clears the bar for concern that it happened, and that it was able to happen. So it's an issue. However, as Lukas brought up, the ad spend, like the amount of money they spent on advertising on social media to try and interfere in an election was incredibly small. The amount of influence they had is debatable, really debatable. I mean, look, I think you can come up with 99 reasons why Hillary Clinton lost, whether it's sexism or that she didn't go to Wisconsin. And you can say it was like Russia, but honestly, the amount, they understood our culture well, they understood that like our culture wars, they understood racism, they understood all of that. I don't think the Russian effort to interfere in our elections is, well, troubling. I don't think it's nearly as sophisticated or as influential as it's often portrayed to be in the media.
I'm sorry, I just want to make one follow-up. I agree that it's less of a big deal than we've all been I mean, it gets way more airtime than it should. But you know what doesn't get enough airtime? The fact that Facebook is bigger than any of these countries. You know, I mean, that's the actual issue. It's not so much Russia. It could be Russia. It could be a white supremacist group. It could be a far left a campaign of disinformation. But there's a platform that is totally automated, completely unregulated, can't keep up with any of this, no matter how much money it spends on it. And I you know, just written a very critical book, so I don't think they're spending nearly as much time or effort as they might. And the company's also very siloed around these issues. But that's the problem. Companies are actually now as powerful, arguably, in this sphere as countries are.
So before we get to the next question in the room, I want to go, we do have some questions from the live stream, and then we'll get back to the questions here. So, so there's some questions about the fact that some journalists have been threatened by the Trump administration. There's this sort of, there's a really negative narrative out there, obviously, and you know, how is that playing out in the media? In your conversations with your colleagues, do you ever feel concerned for your personal safety? And related, how do you predict that your various outlets that you work for are going to strategize for coverage of this upcoming election?
On the threats to journalists, very quick, there have been some very real threats, and I think that I think it should be a reasonable expectation of everyone in this country that you should be able to be a practicing journalist and go to a Trump rally and not have someone throw things at you, call you expletives, yell at you. I think it's a reasonable expectation that we should live in a more civil society than that. By the same token, those journalists who, like, you know, stand up in the name of greater access to the White House, or who get 15 minutes of airtime on primetime news on cable because someone yelled at them that they were fake news, those people are not heroes. The people who light their hair on fire over the fact that there's no White House press briefing, those people are not heroes. War correspondents are heroes. So like the Jim Acostas of the world who just like go out there and make this case that somehow we're living in this time when the press is like under siege is not true. The press is not under siege. The press is out there. The press goes to every rally. The press is doing fine. It is not, there's no obligation of the White House to hold a press briefing every day. And I think just most importantly, there's so many more pressing issues in the world, in the country right now for Americans than like the fate of the media. And nothing aggravates me more than when the media makes the story about itself, right? And I truly do not think that if you're concerned about a participatory democracy where people care about and trust the news, there are certain news organizations that need to stop spending more time covering the fact that reporters got yelled at by Trump supporters than worrying about the issues that actually matter to middle-class Americans.
So on the first point about being threatened or bullied, yeah, it happens to everybody. I'm always amazed, have been amazed in the last 2 years, how quickly if I write something negative about the president, the sort of troll community on social media are right on you, and the amount of, you know, I can barely even look at my Twitter feed after this stuff comes up, and, you know, all kinds of derogatory remarks about being a woman, being a Muslim. You know, there's often confusion about, I'm actually half Turkish, half Swedish, but I have a Persian surname, but everybody will accuse me of being an Arab terrorist. I mean, it's, you know, this goes to foreign policy and education, different panel. But conversely, I've also been accused by some FT readers of being a Trump supporter because I've written pieces about why I think the campus culture wars are illiberal, or why I think we need to pay more attention to the concerns of people in certain red states. So I actually think that that's a kind of a mark of success and of the robustness of the debate we're having right now, that, you know, everybody's out there. But in terms of the real issues, which I completely agree with you, so don't want media to be the topic, I think that the big issue that the FT is looking at as we plan the entire architecture of coverage in the next couple of years is the fact that we are at, I think, and many of us at the paper think, we're at a change point economically and politically that's very similar to where we were in the late 1970s, when you saw the rise of neoliberalism, the rise of Chicago school thinking, free market economics, Reagan and Thatcher, crushing of the unions, a sort of opening up of the corporate sphere, financialization, all of that, which then lasted 40 years, has arguably had some merits, but has now, I would say, a lot of people would say, has gone to extremes. I think we're now at a tipping point where it's going to be all about, okay, we've had all this wealth creation, but how's it going to be distributed? And within that, there's some predictable stories that are being covered about inequality, but I think that there's some bigger and deeper and very long-lasting stories about, for example, the millennials versus the boomers. Who's going to get what part of what is, I think, going to be a shrinking pie in the U.S. I think the U.S. is going to decline relative to other countries economically, and the state is going to have, which I think is going to become more powerful, is going to have to figure out how to divide up the pie, and there's going to be a war over entitlements versus student debt. What are we going to invest in? Who's going to benefit? How is that all going to play out? And so that's the kind of really 35,000-foot picture that we're thinking about.
I think I agree with Dylan. I think there's a lot has been said about media access and the sort of decorum of the way the White House operates. They don't really have a lot of decorum, so it shouldn't be surprising that they run their press relations in such a sort of abhorrent way. But at the same time, it hasn't stopped stories from happening. It's not like, oh, suddenly there's no information coming out of Washington. There's tons of great reporting that's come out of us. As a journalist, you're supposed to be able to be adaptable. Okay, so, you know, they're not holding a press briefing. I can't lob a question at this punching bag every day. So we just call somebody else, you know, and they give us the information. I mean, I think what you have, it's like, we don't live, it's still a democratic process. We're not in an autocratic state where there's just information is just shut down and there's things going on and nobody can find out about it. So it's a bit overblown. I mean, it's upsetting. It's certainly the toxic atmosphere, social media, and people getting assaulted, you know, verbally and, you know, in writing it's awful. But I don't know if that's like greatly new. I mean, I got hate mail in letter form. I used to get voicemails before social media. Now it just comes in a different format. In terms of how things are going to be covered going forward, I mean, look, I think it's just everyone's just trying to be mindful of this landscape of disinformation and how to tackle it. I mean, I know from, you know, our perspective at the Wall Street Journal, I mean, we really just try and like not cover it as a horse race. We try not to cover it as the palace intrigue question and the stuff that's like really in the end is a bunch of bullshit. We try and just stick to like, this is something that's impactful. There's, you know, financial or economic implications for a trade war decision, like, and just focus in on these real issues. You know, but you know, 24-hour news channels have a lot of time to fill, and there's not always a lot going on. So I just got to talk about everything else. So
you'll forgive me. I'm going to ask a question about the fate of the media, but first, I'm the parent of 2 BSEC graduates. It is wonderful to be back here and hear words like discernment, and it all comes down to education from this stage. I'm also a career-long journalist, and as you know, the long tradition of church and state meant that journalists were not concerned about how the business operated. my question to you, the fate of the media, is it more important now for young journalists to understand the business structure of journalism to basically have the media survive and thrive? I mean, I would encourage you, I see you shaking your heads, to have that conversation with young journalists, as I do, about understand, what the business structure is of your organization.
You go. Oh, no, sure.
We're all in here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with this. I mean, this is certainly a question. I mean, the fundamental schism in a traditional newsroom of advertising and distribution on one side and the editorial process on the other, I mean, it's completely broken down now because the distribution is part of the editorial process. So that already is like, used to be I'd write my story, I'd send it to the editor, he'd edit it, it'd get laid out on the page, and then it wasn't our problem anymore. It was this other side to the business. But now it's like, oh, we got to think about the headline, we got to think about SEO, we got to think about a social media strategy, which is basically you're part of a business strategy there. So that's already broken down. Advertising is really not the business anymore, unfortunately. I mean, that's the other fundamental breakdown of the traditional media model. Print advertising is ebbing away completely. Digital advertising is a minimal business, and it's been eaten up by the tech giants. So it becomes about the relationship with the reader, which is a very different business model. And that is a much more engaged thing for the editorial side. I don't profess to have like great answers on like how to bridge the gap, but that is a fundamental change. So the idea that I can just write my story and send it and then that's it, like I have no other role in this, like that's already gone. So yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think if people are coming into this business thinking that they can, be walled off from it, that's probably not the best approach.
I think it's a hugely important issue, and it's something I actually struggle with a lot and feel kind of guilty about sometimes, because I made a really decided choice about 10 years ago to get out of management and become kind of what I consider to be a journalistic entrepreneur. So I have 4 jobs, essentially. I work for the FT as a columnist, I work for CNN as an analyst, I write books and I give speeches, and I need to do all of those things in the current environment to pay for housing and education in New York City. And so that presents a real problem for individual institutions, but I would argue, and I'm curious what you guys would say, I think to coverage, because what I'm finding is that over the last few years, we've gotten to have a very bifurcated newsroom, where you've got superstars and then you've got others. And a lot of people doing very important jobs that sit behind the wall, are not public figures, don't get to have the opportunities for that kind of entrepreneurialism. You can do it within the context of the organization, but it's not as easy. If you're an editor, that's a hugely important job. If you're a manager, but you may not be getting a lot of the upside. And this paradigm, and this is so true about media, because I think tech's driving everything. And media, music, and finance were hit and disintermediated by tech faster than anybody else. And so our challenges are coming to a store near you.
Rudy, if I may, I work for Billboard magazine.
There you go.
Boast, as a print journalist covering the music business, I've had a front row seat to the total digital destruction of 2 multi-billion-dollar global businesses.
There you go.
So I just would say to your question, do journalists and media organizations need to think more about the business aspect and not just the journalism? And I would say absolutely. We're not like, too many journalists I know are entitled to the belief that somehow, because they are practicing journalism and because journalism is integral to the health of a democracy, that their article that like 13 people want to read, they should get paid for it. No, we live in a capitalist, it's like this is a business. If you do not give people a product that they want to read, you do not deserve, you don't get to do it. I'm sorry, I believe it. And look, the degradation of local journalism is a tragedy, right? It's a real tragedy that there are cities and towns where institutions are not being held to account because those news organizations got beat up or couldn't figure out how to make it work. And I fundamentally believe that it would be great if we could figure out a way
to make it work. But this is not, journalism is not, outside of a few institutions, journalism is not a charity project. So you have to figure out how to make it work. You do. Because, I mean, and like, don't take it from me, take it from the fact that, you know, look what happened to Billboard. I mean, people need to get serious. Yeah, people need to get serious about that. And you need to think about creating a product that people actually want, otherwise your product is going to go away. Now, I will say this. We are approaching a moment, the story of our time is that Facebook and Google came in, they took the distribution, they took all of the ad money, they left pennies on the table to be divided up across every news organization, whether that's the New York Times or BuzzFeed or whoever. And there's going to be a slight course correction because what's going to happen is Facebook, along with Google and Apple News, are going to understand that news is added value to their platforms, that it really doesn't pay well to piss off the news industry, and it is going to cost them, relative to the amount of money they have, it is going to be chump change for them to give some money to these news organizations. And pretty soon you're going to see every news organization getting a few $1 million every year from Facebook, and then Apple and Google are going to have to step up and do the same thing, and that will become a new revenue stream for these news organizations. But the idea that somehow like Google and Facebook, you know, destroyed the news business and that they owe them, no, like they came along and they created the distribution system, and that's why they got the advertising money. That's not, yeah.
I have to respond to this. Google and Facebook are terrified because they destroyed local news. They're now desperately trying to give money to buy publications, and guess what? All the big ones have taken it. Every name brand has taken it, and then they set up requirements. They won't say that they do, but you can see it on the pages if you're looking carefully. They set up requirements for what you can and can't say. It's a very subtle cognitive capture. We should put a hard line on that the way we would with any other advertiser. Not a solution.
So I'm not 100% familiar with them buying up local news organizations, but
No, not organizations. They have Google has, I happen to know a lot about this topic. Google has a 500, I believe it's 500 million, don't quote me on that, but it's a very large pot of money. Facebook has the same for local news development, and they get out there usually in a week where the FTC is trying to sue them for something and tell everybody how much they're doing for local media. They've got two reasons for that. They've realized that the paradigm is shifting for them. They're going to get regulated. They'll probably become public utilities, and then it's game over. Most of the smart investors that I know are already out of those stocks because they see this coming. We're going into a downturn. That's going to be a bad time to be in advertising. They realize that they've eaten everyone's lunch, and in this completely kind of Darwinian or perhaps Marxist way, if you want to look at it that way, you know, the product that they've monetized is now gone. So they're desperate. I think one solution we haven't talked about, which may have legs, is a public option. You look at the BBC, for example, you know, not a perfect institution, but or ProPublica. I think that there may be some place for those kinds of organizations. But I also think that there could be a way for a public-private partnership to take some of the subscription news that you have to pay a lot of money for, the Times at the FT, and bring it to the masses. I mean, we're already doing that at the FT. We donate the paper to various universities and schools. Times is doing stuff like that. There's a lot we can do that doesn't involve taking an advertiser's money and letting them dictate content.
I agree with that, and I would just say I agree with Lucas too. I think the advertising, the future of media is not advertising. I am not by any means suggesting that it hasn't been a really hard go for media organizations. It has been, and I'm not suggesting that that is somehow a good thing or even a tolerable thing. All I am saying is that everything is a business, and you don't just get to do it because you think you get to do it. You have to create a product that people want, and if you don't do it, you're gonna fall under.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. We can do one from here and one from the live stream. So if you want to say your question, and then I'll read the one from the live stream, and you can consider them both together.
Okay. Hi. So you were talking actually just now about how journalism is a business and how like you have to kind of monetize your product. But like in the beginning of the panel, you were saying that because journalism has become like such a competitive business, it's led to like the rise of fake news and stories that aren't really news to kind of like get views and get clicks. But you also talked about like having this kind of like idealistic news outlet which would give you the entertainment and the news, but without actually taking away from the substance. And you said that one way to kind of start this would be to have panels like this, but this isn't really getting out. This isn't reaching the entire population. I mean, this is not the entire population. This is not representative of the entire population. It is, and like also like what you said, like donating newspapers, like that's just, to universities, like which is already like you have to be really privileged to go to university. So what I'm asking, with all these contradictions that you've been giving, is like how would you actually create this like idealistic news source, or like do you even think that it's possible to have completely like to have this kind of news source in like the economy of today?
I think that's an excellent question. Then we have one from the live stream as well. What do you see as the top issue that will be the most important to the American public in the 2020 election?
There really is no clean answer to any of this. I mean, what we deal with, like as media organizations, is this push and pull between what do readers actually want and what do we think is important, and that is like good for, public consumption. And these things don't always line up. I mean, I remember reading a biography of somebody who worked for the New York Times in the 40s. And he wrote about how every Sunday they would send a reporter to like 20 different big churches around the city. And they would write a little thing about this was the sermon that was told every Sunday. And they would have a whole page of sermons from around the city. Literally nobody ever read this, but it was like, we are marking the public record, and this was considered important. At some point they dropped that page because they realized, well, look, nobody's reading it. This is kind of the economics of the business that we're in now, is that, sending a reporter to the community board meeting every week or every month or whatever it is, and most of the time you're expending resources on something where there actually is probably not actually much news that comes out of it. But once in a while there will be, and you'll only know that if you go every single time. And then you write that story about some decision that was made on a local zoning thing, and nobody reads it because it's of interest to a very small group of people. So you're having to make these calculated decisions now because there's not a lot of money to be spent, not a lot of resources, and you say, well, we need to get the stuff that's actually going to bring in readers, bring in subscribers, and so you go to the stuff that has the biggest bang for the buck, which is the kind of the sexiest headline, that kind of stuff. It's a push and pull. There's no easy answer to this. How do we get people more engaged? I don't know. I mean, it's like I wish people would just be more engaged. It's kind of like I can't force you to read this thing. I can't force you to eat, eat your Wheaties if you have Frosted Flakes next to it. It's like, it's a tough challenge. I don't have an easy answer for that. 2020 election, biggest issue. I mean, it really depends on where the economy is in the next 8 to 10 months. If things really sink fast, that's going to be the biggest issue, I think.
So I'll start with the latter. I agree. It'll be the economy. Will we be in recession or not is the big question. I think if we are in a recession, or if we feel like we're in a recession to a large enough number of people, I think that's going to be it. That will be the issue people vote on. And I think that could mean that we don't get another Trump presidency. I saw some really interesting polling data recently showing that working class white women in some of the swing states are starting to turn against him based on kind of kitchen table issues, not culture issues, but hey, you said you were going to make the economy better, and my prescription drug prices and healthcare premium increases are eating up the minuscule increase in wages that I may have seen thanks to your totally dysfunctional policies that have been pushed with tax cuts, et cetera. So I think that's going to be the big issue. On engagement, it's funny, I almost wish sometimes that we had less engagement. I wish that people were more still, tweeted less, actually read a story to the end. I mean, it's, you know, it's amazing because we all, I'm sure you guys get the data. You can see now how far people have read in your story. And it's stunning how little they do read, although it's pretty good at the FT relative. I don't think that there is a silver bullet answer to the problem. I think we're going to see, as we did in the 19th century in the media landscape, it's going to be really varied. I think that you're going to see some high levels, very high quality subscription media. I think by and large you're going to have to pay a little bit more for media than you have. I think the big mistake that the media and the music business ever made was giving it away for free.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that last point. In terms of 2020, it's the economy. It almost always is. To your question, is that your daughter? Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was a great question. You are super smart. Look, here's what I would say is, your question is a great way to synthesize everything we've been talking about up here. One of those things is, yes, the news media is a business, and it is I wouldn't say it's an entertainment business always, it can be, but it's an engagement business, and you have to keep people engaged. And the really bad news, the really like sad, terrible thing, so in cable news now, you measure audience on a second by second or minute by minute basis. So you can actually see, you don't just see how many people watched a show, you see when people drop off. When CNN stops talking about Trump and goes to a different story, the audiences go like that, like immediately. And so that seems really bad because like, okay, we're doomed in this world where we have to just, the news has to be this like salacious, controversial, conflict-ridden subject matter that is not benefiting society. The good news is that, I go back to this, not that many people watch cable news, right? So when you think of what news is and you define what news is and you think about a more optimistic, idealistic version of what news can be, a far more influential platform in the middle of the day than CNN or MSNBC or Fox News is The View on ABC, which is this sort of confluence of women sitting around the table talking about every issue under the sun, cultural issues, political issues. There is a way that the political conversation, that people who captivate wider audiences that are not strictly defined as news could start to have greater influence on the political conversation. The amount of people who are on Snapchat blows cable news out of the water. The amount of people that get their news through social media platforms blows cable news out of the water. There are opportunities here. I don't think I'm being overly idealistic. There are opportunities here for captivating personalities to come along and start influencing the conversation in a way that goes to all those things I was talking about earlier, which is more compassionate, which is more understanding, which is more nuanced, which doesn't exist in 15-second sound bites or 140 characters. I think people want that. I fundamentally believe people want that. And I do believe we can get there. And there's no world where we just keep going down this path of fewer and fewer people watching dumber and dumber people debate more heavily partisan issues. That's not the future.
On that note, well, I'm actually heartened by this discussion to hear the three of you say that you think the media is in actually a pretty strong place despite all the negative things we hear and a lot of the narrative going on. So that's good news and good to hear from the source. And thank you for sharing all of your insights with us this evening. And on behalf of our audience around the world, I don't know how many we had, we'll see afterwards, and everyone here at BSEC Manhattan, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and thanks to our panelists.